The 2023 NBA draft is incredibly interesting, not just because it's so talented, especially at the top of the class, but also there are some really intriguing fits throughout the league. Teams have gotten really good at rebuilding and putting themselves in a good position to continue to add talent to their roster, and these three players at the top of the draft have some pretty perfect fits out there at the top of the lottery. So let's begin at number 3 overall. In my opinion right now, 2 and 3, you can swap back and forth between either Brandon Miller or Scoot Henderson, and it really does depend on which teams end up with the second and the third pick. However, right now I would probably put Brandon Miller just a little bit underneath Scoot Henderson as the number 3 overall prospect. And in terms of ideal circumstances for him, I think it's pretty obvious. There are a lot of teams around the league that desperately need a wing, especially younger teams that need not just the typical 3-and-D guy that Miller I think can become, but also someone that's a threat on the perimeter that can score, that can also guard as well, gives you good size. There's really good guards that come into the league every year, but getting a high upside wing like Brandon Miller at the top of this draft is really, really valuable. And there's a couple of teams that come to mind here for me in terms of teams that are a really good fit for Brandon Miller. First and foremost is the Houston Rockets, a team that probably needs a wing more than almost any other young team in the entire league. They've got some interesting guys on the perimeter, but in terms of a true, really high upside wing player, they're really lacking in that department. A new coach, Ime Udoka, has a ton of experience, developing these high upside wings in his year in Boston with, of course, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Those guys loved him as coach, and I think that Miller, although he does come in with some maturity issues, I think that kind of matches what the rest of the roster in Houston, has to deal with in terms of maturity issues on the court and things like that. Udoka is a perfect fit for that, and I think just from a roster perspective, in terms of the kind of player that Miller can become, I think he's perfect in Houston. Some other teams as well, a team like Detroit that already has Cade and Jaden Ivey, getting another guy alongside them that can continue to grow alongside those two guys is really critical. Then even a team like Portland, I think, is really interesting. You want to talk about a guy that could change everything for Portland moving forward. If Brandon Miller hits the way that a lot of people think that he might, that changes everything that we think about what could possibly happen with Damian Lillard over the next couple of seasons, that really raises the ceiling of the young core of this group. Now let's move on to number 2. This one is a little bit more clear to me. It's a little bit more streamlined. Scoot Henderson, in my opinion, is the second best prospect in the class, and for me, San Antonio is just the ideal fit for this guy. I mean, he is just everything that he needs to work on and develop at the NBA level matches up with what San Antonio typically has been good at, as well as he brings the Spurs exactly what they need moving forward. Because as many interesting young players as they have, Keldon Johnson, Jeremy Sohan, there's still something missing in terms of this like alpha mentality. This guy that is going to be the perimeter scorer, the creator, the lead pick and roll guy, the guy that's going to create for everyone else. And I think Scoot Henderson can absolutely be that guy, and I think it is a perfect situation for him. If he develops as a jump shooter and becomes a better perimeter scorer from outside 18 feet, he is going to be a devastating offensive player, especially early on in his career. He reminds me a little bit of a shorter version of John Wall, because John Wall was like legit 6'4". Scoot Henderson's not that tall, but in terms of his athleticism, his ability to get the rim, and some issues in terms of his jump shot, that's kind of who he reminds me of, but even more competitive and even more explosive and a little bit better of a playmaker as well. And all of that is really exciting to me, especially in terms of how it translates to San Antonio. That, to me, if I could make one thing happen in the entirety of the draft, I think it would be this. I think Scoot in San Antonio is a perfect marriage of a team that needs what he provides. There aren't going to be a ton of other guards that are going to necessarily get in his way. He's going to be allowed to grow and develop and the player that he needs to be, and San Antonio should do a fantastic job of developing him as well. And as is always the case with the 2023 NBA draft, the conversation ends with Victor Wembanyama. It's very clear he's going to go number 1 overall, and to me, in terms of perfect fits, it's hard obviously to narrow it down to just one team when a guy is as talented as he is, but I generally think more about teams that are a little bit more ready to do something once they add Wembanyama. So Houston, I don't think is a fantastic fit just because they already have a good amount of like projects and up and coming young guys. I not to say negative things about Houston here, but I want him to be on a team that has proven guys around him already and can bring the franchise success almost immediately after drafting Victor Wembanyama. And some of these destinations might not seem super exciting to you in the first place, but they are to me. A team like Utah, I think, would be really interesting for Wembanyama. They've got a ton of pieces there. They've got a ton of assets moving forward. That would be a really interesting combination, especially alongside the rookie, Walker Kessler, in terms of not having Wembanyama just have to play the 5. Those two guys on the floor defensively together would be unbelievable in terms of the size and the length. In a similar situation, every time we talk talking about size and length, you're talking about Orlando. They've got a ton of just really weird, switchable, two-way players that are big and have great skill sets. Like a lineup of or a front court of Paolo, Victor Wembanyama, and Bol Bol or Wendell Carter Jr. That's really, really interesting to me. And even though Orlando arguably needs a little bit more in terms of guard help, and maybe you think Scoot Henderson is a perfect fit for them if they are able to jump up towards the top of the lottery with their own selection, I think that would be a super cool combination with, Franz, Paolo, Victor Wembanyama, and everybody else that they've got there. That would be super, super fun. And again, I think would pretty immediately put them in position to win between 40 and 45 games in Wembanyama's rookie year, because I think that Orlando team is unbelievably talented. Another team that comes to mind for me would be Dallas. It would require crazy lottery luck for them to go all the way up to number 1, but Wembanyama alongside Luka and then maybe Kyrie as well, that completely saves everything for Dallas moving forward. It would be kind of like what Dallas hoped Kristaps Porzingis would be when they brought him into Dallas, except for, even a whole nother level above that with Wembanyama. And again, it allows him to have some time to develop, but they're going to be good almost immediately. And without the weirdness of the end of last year, Dallas is still a decent roster. They'll have some opportunities to replace some of the guys they traded away for Kyrie, and Wemby going there would be awesome. But to me, by far my favorite destination for Victor Wembanyama is the Oklahoma City Thunder. It's only a 1.7% chance that he's going to end up there in Oklahoma City, because that's the only chance Oklahoma City has to get the number 1 pick. But when you think about him alongside Chet, Jalen Williams, Josh Giddey, SGA, even if they end up moving on from either Giddey or Williams or Chet or whatever the case may be, SGA, Wemby, and all the picks, all the assets, all the young players, all the role players that they already have established there would be unbelievable, and honestly borderline unfair for the rest of the league if Victor Wembanyama did end up in Oklahoma City. And if you want to talk about my perfect, places for each of these guys to go, I would say for Brandon Miller, Houston, number 3, number 2, Scoot Henderson, San Antonio, and number 1, Victor Wembanyama in Oklahoma City, even though that is incredibly unrealistic. And the reason that all of this is important is because this is a really critical draft class for the league. It's been hyped up for so long. These are 3 incredibly talented players, but also each of them have their own flaws. As great of a prospect as Wembanyama is, you do still worry about, potential injury issues, him being very skinny, trying to figure out what his role is going to be at the NBA level. And more importantly, the environment that he gets put in at the NBA level, I think is going to be important too, just how much of his ceiling he actually reaches. Henderson, we already talked about it, some of the jump shot stuff, a little bit of decision-making stuff as well. I love his competitiveness, but he's a little bit small, and there's just less margin for error for smaller guards at the NBA level. And then Miller has had some issues off the floor as well as on the court, especially in the NCAA tournament, where he's not very good. And, he needs to continue to improve all around as an offensive player, and is the most raw player at the top of this class that is being considered currently for a top 3 pick. And the reason that I bring all this up is I think each of these guys are unbelievably talented and have an opportunity to each be all-stars and then maybe even above that. And I think the situation that they go to really, really matters. Obviously, Wembanyama is incredible, but the situation that Scoot and Brandon Miller go to, I think, are going to have a lot to do with where they end up. And I think there's some really good fits at the top of this class, and I'm hoping that that is where they end up. And over the last couple of drafts, this has kind of been a theme where we have a big 3 at the top of the class. Obviously, last year was Paolo, Chet, and Jabari Smith. And going back to 2019, it was Zion, RJ, and Ja. And again, I think in those examples, you can see how much it really matters where each of these individual players end up. But bottom line is, I'm very excited to see what all 3 of these guys do at the NBA level. And I think these teams specifically will be a pretty perfect match for them.